It's 1963. Detroit is loud, arrogant, and absolutely obsessed with one thing: cubic inches. Bigger is better. More displacement means more power. More power means more wins. And more wins mean dominance on the street and the track. Ford is pushing FE big blocks, 352s, 390s, and soon the legendary 427. Chevrolet is quietly perfecting the 409 with its distinctive W-head design and raw, unfiltered power delivery. Chrysler is preparing to unleash the Hemi, 426 cubic inches of pure intimidation. Every automaker is in an arms race to build the biggest, meanest V8 they possibly can. Magazines are writing headlines about displacement. Drag strips are measuring success in cubic inches. And insurance companies are starting to take notice. And then there's Pontiac, because while everyone else is chasing size, Pontiac does something that, on paper, makes absolutely no sense. They shrink their engine. Most people have no idea that one of Pontiac's biggest performance legends didn't start with a fire-breathing 389 or a monstrous 421. It started with 326 cubic inches. And what happened next changed everything. You think you know Pontiac's muscle car story? Not like this. Back in the early 1960s, Pontiac had already tasted performance glory. The 389 cubic inch V8 powering cars, like the GTO, was making serious noise in both NASCAR ovals and NHRA drag racing. With a 4.06-inch bore and a 3.75-inch stroke, that engine could produce up to 348 horsepower in tri-power form. 3 two-barrel carburetors working in harmony. Pete Estes, Pontiac's chief engineer, had built a brand identity around performance. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday wasn't just a slogan. It was the entire business model. Pontiac was cool, Pontiac was fast, and Pontiac was winning. But there was a problem. General Motors had an internal rule, a strict one. No intermediate-sized car was allowed to have an engine larger than 330 cubic inches. The bean counters in Detroit had decided this would prevent internal brand competition. Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick were all building mid-size cars, and GM didn't want them cannibalizing each other's sales with overlapping performance offerings. Big engines were reserved for full-size models. Intermediate cars got smaller V8s. That was the rule. And that meant the brand new Pontiac Tempest, a sleek, lightweight intermediate that was perfect for performance, couldn't legally receive the 389. So the engineers did something clever. Some would say sneaky. They took the existing Pontiac V8 architecture and reduced the bore from 4.06 inches down to just 3.72 inches while keeping the same 3.75-inch stroke. That gave them a total displacement of 326 cubic inches, just 4 cubic inches under the corporate limit. Technically compliant, completely legal by GM's internal standards. But mechanically, still a full-blooded Pontiac V8. Same basic block design, same deep skirt architecture that gave the block rigidity under high loads, same 5.2-inch connecting rods, longer than most competing designs, which reduced piston side loading and improved durability. Same rugged cast iron crankshaft that had already survived countless quarter-mile runs in heavier cars. The deck height was identical to the 389. The main bearing journals were the same diameter. Even the head bolt pattern was unchanged. It looked small on paper, but there was something hiding inside that nobody expected. The base 326 was introduced in 1963 with a modest 8.6.1 compression ratio, producing around 250 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor. Not exactly terrifying. In fact, most buyers saw it as just another economy V8, something to check off the options list between the inline 6 and the premium big block. But then came the high output version. Now things got interesting. With a 4-barrel carburetor, usually a Rochester Quadrajet or Carter AFB depending on the year, a more aggressive camshaft with longer duration and higher lift, and a bumped-up At 10.5.1 compression ratio, the 326 HO produced 280 horsepower and around 355 lb-ft of torque from just 326 cubic inches in a car that weighed under 3,400 pounds. Compare that to a full-size Catalina with a 389, which tipped the scales at nearly 4,000 pounds. And you start to see the advantage. That kind of power-to-weight ratio didn't just make the Tempest quick, it made it dangerous. Drivers who weren't expecting that much torque from a small engine would light up the tires at stoplights, lose traction mid-corner, and generally find themselves in over their heads. One road tester from Car and Driver wrote, "The 326 HO doesn't announce itself. It just goes, and if you're not ready, it goes without you." But there was a problem. At high RPM, especially above 5,500, oil pressure would begin to drop, not dramatically at first, just enough to worry the engineers who were monitoring gauge readouts during dyno testing. And then the real nightmare started. During endurance testing at GM's proving grounds in Milford, Michigan, engines pushed past 6,000 RPM for sustained periods would begin showing signs of bearing wear. Teardown inspections after 50-hour full-throttle runs revealed scoring on the main journals. Metal flakes suspended in the oil pan, discoloration on the bearing surfaces that indicated heat stress. The crankshaft wasn't being fed consistently. At sustained high speeds, the oiling system, designed primarily for street driving and highway cruising, was starving the bottom end first. Oil was being sent to the valve train, the rocker arms, the push rods, while the crankshaft, spinning at over 6,000 RPM and handling hundreds of foot-pounds of combustion force, was getting whatever was left over. And when the crank goes dry, everything dies. Pontiac engineers knew they couldn't just make it bigger. That would break GM's rules and kill the entire program before it even launched. So instead, they made it smarter. They revised the oil passages in the block, improving flow to the main bearings before feeding the valve train. It wasn't quite the later priority main oiling system you'd see in full race-prepped engines, but it dramatically improved reliability at higher RPM. They also introduced stronger valve springs to prevent float at high engine speeds and revised lifter profiles to reduce friction and improve oil return. The camshaft received its own dedicated oil gallery with improved flow characteristics. The result? Suddenly, this small V8 could spin harder than many of its bigger rivals. And that mattered, because while a 427 Ford or a 409 Chevy might make more peak horsepower, they were also lugging around hundreds of extra pounds and couldn't safely rev past 6,000 RPM without risking catastrophic failure. The 326, with its improved oiling and lighter reciprocating mass, could pull cleanly to 6,200, sometimes 6,500 in race trim. At the 1964 NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona, several privately entered Tempests equipped with 326 HO engines began surprising competitors in the stock eliminator classes. Quarter-mile times dropped into the low 14-second range. Some even dipped into the high 13s with slicks and minor tuning, things like advancing the timing a few degrees, rejetting the carburetor, and removing the air cleaner. Trap speeds? Over 100 miles per hour. From an engine most racers had laughed at just months earlier. One mechanic, who had been prepping big block Chevys for years, reportedly said after a teardown inspection of a 326 that had just run a string of 1380s, "We expected it to come apart. We thought we'd find wiped bearings, scored cylinders, maybe a cracked piston, but the bearings looked clean, like it hadn't even been pushed." But Pontiac wasn't done yet, because in 1965, they refined the 326 even further. The block received additional ribbing for improved rigidity. The cylinder heads were revised with slightly larger ports and better flow characteristics. Some versions received stronger connecting rod bolts, going from 3 8-inch to 7 16-inch to handle increased cylinder pressures. Compression ratios remained high, around 10.5.1 for the HO version, but cam timing was optimized for mid-range torque rather than peak horsepower. The power curve became fatter, broader. Instead of making all its power at 5,500 RPM, It now pulled hard from 3,000 all the way to 6,000. Horsepower climbed to 285. Torque remained a stump-pulling 355 lb-ft, now arriving at just 3,200 RPM. And in the lightweight Tempest and LeMans platforms, that torque hit hard. Road tests from the time recorded 0 to 60 mph times in the mid-7-second range, respectable even by today's standards. Quarter-mile runs in 15.1 seconds at 92 mph for bone-stock street cars with bias-ply tires, single exhaust, and full interior. With better tires and careful shifting, high 14s weren't uncommon. Drop in a set of headers, gut the exhaust, and tune the carburetor properly. Some racers were seeing 13.70s on street gas. You can probably guess what happened next. Street racers started noticing. Because while the guy next to you at the stoplight might have had a bigger engine, maybe a 352 Ford FE or a Chevy 327, the Pontiac 326 had one huge advantage: less weight over the front wheels, better balance, and a willingness to rev. That 3.72-inch bore allowed for relatively large valves in proportion to displacement, 2.02-inch intakes, and 1.66-inch exhausts in the best HO heads, improving airflow at higher engine speeds. The shorter cylinder walls also meant reduced piston skirt friction, allowing the engine to spin more freely past 6,000 RPM. It didn't just make power, it held it all the way through the power band. No sudden drop-off, no dead spots, just a smooth, linear pull that kept building until you ran out of nerve or gears. And that changed everything. By 1966, Pontiac had installed the 326 in thousands of Tempests, LeMans models, and even base GTOs, though most GTO buyers still opted for the larger 389. Production numbers soared past 100,000 units across various configurations that year alone. And reliability? Shockingly good. Owners reported engines running well past 100,000 miles with minimal internal work, even after repeated drag strip visits. The improved oiling system meant bearings lasted, the longer connecting rods reduced piston slap, and the conservative piston-to-wall clearances meant the engine stayed quiet even as the miles piled up. One owner from Michigan later said, "I beat the hell out of that car for 3 years, raced it every weekend, daily drove it all week. When I finally sold it with 87,000 miles, it still had factory oil pressure and didn't burn a drop." But there was a catch. As emissions regulations loomed toward the end of the decade, compression ratios had to fall. The Clean Air Act was being debated in Congress. California had already implemented its own emissions standards, and GM knew what was coming. By 1967, many 326 engines were detuned to around 9.2.1 compression, dropping output to roughly 250 horsepower. Still respectable, still capable of mid-15-second quarter-mile times. But the edge was gone. The golden age was ending. Insurance companies began targeting performance models with ruthless efficiency. Premiums for muscle cars doubled, then tripled. Young buyers, the core demographic for these cars, were being priced out of the market entirely. A 22-year-old with a 326 HO Tempest might pay $800 a year in insurance. The same driver with a GTO, over $2,500. And internally, Pontiac was already looking ahead, because sitting in the wings was a new engine, the 350. With a larger 3.875-inch bore and the same 3.75-inch stroke, it displaced 350 cubic inches. It offered more power without significantly increasing weight or production cost. The tooling could be shared, the assembly line could handle it, and it fit neatly into GM's evolving corporate structure. By 1968, the 326 was quietly phased out. Production ended mid-year. Tooling was repurposed for the 350. And just like that, the engine nobody believed in was gone. No fanfare, no final edition, no collector models, just gone. But its legacy didn't disappear, because the 326 proved something critical at exactly the right moment in automotive history. You didn't need the biggest engine to win. You needed the smartest one. With its 3.72-inch bore, 3.75-inch stroke, high compression ratios, and surprisingly robust bottom end after the oiling revisions, the Pontiac 326 V8 delivered real-world performance that embarrassed larger engines on both the street and the strip. It survived high RPM abuse after its oiling system was improved. It delivered mid-14-second quarter-mile times in showroom trim, and it helped Pontiac sneak serious performance into intermediate cars without breaking GM's own rules that were designed specifically to prevent exactly what Pontiac accomplished. It was a loophole, exploited perfectly. Today, the 326 is often overlooked in favor of its bigger siblings, the 389, the 400, the 455. Collectors chase GTOs with tri-power setups and Ram air hoods, but the people who know, they remember the 326. They remember the engine that proved cubic inches weren't everything. They remember the oiling problems that got fixed, the bearing failures that got solved, the high RPM potential that nobody expected. And they remember that for a brief moment in the mid-1960s, Pontiac built an engine that did everything it wasn't supposed to do: rev high, run hard, and win. That's why people still talk about it today. Not because it was the biggest, but because it wasn't supposed to matter. And yet, it did. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you want to see next. Another forgotten underdog, another rivalry, or another engine Detroit tried to hide. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the machines that changed muscle car history. Because not every legend gets the recognition it deserves. Some just get forgotten. But the truth doesn't disappear.